Have you ever stopped to think about how some words, they seem simple, right? But underneath, they're packed with history, sometimes really difficult history.
Oh,
They
absolutely.
carry echoes of old fights, meanings way beyond just the dictionary definition.
Yeah.
And today, we're going to do a deep dive into a word exactly like that.
Geopolitics.
And it's a perfect example. Its journey, intellectually speaking, has been, well, let's just say complicated and pretty fraught, actually.
Trot is a good word.
Yeah, some people flat out called it an intellectual poison. I mean, that phrase alone tells you something's going on there.
Definitely hints at a dark past.
But then for others, it's still seen as this, vital way of looking at the world, understanding how things work internationally. It's fascinatingly controversial.
It really is. So that's our mission today. We want to unpack the fascinating and often really challenging story behind geopolitics.
Hmm.
We'll look at where it came from, how it shot up in influence, then crashed down. We have to talk about its connection to some of the really dark moments of the 20th century. We do.
But we're not stopping there. We'll also look at how it's kind of made this surprising comeback and how people are rethinking it today.
Exactly. And what this dive should show is how factors like geography, territory, resources, how they've been seen as shaping what states do.
Right.
But also, and this is key, how those ideas about geography and power, they themselves are products of specific times, specific cultures.
Okay.
So the goal, really, is to give you, the listener, a richer, more nuanced picture. Hopefully you can connect some dots, maybe have a few aha moments about this really powerful, but yeah, often misunderstood concept.
Let's get into it then. Part one. The troubled birth of an idea, starting around 1899, maybe going up to World War I.
Okay.
So let's unpack this. Our story really kicks off right at the turn of the century, 1899 specifically. A Swedish political scientist, Rudolf Kjellin, coins the term geopolitics. And this is where it gets interesting right away. Our sources say it was almost immediately linked to the belligerent dramas of the 20th century, like it was born under a bad sign or something.
It does feel a bit like that, yeah. Cagellan, when he coined it, he had a very clear purpose. He saw it as a hard-nosed way to look at international politics.
More realistic, maybe.
Exactly, more realistic. He thought the approach at the time was too focused on laws and treaties, overly legalistic, he called it. He wanted something grounded in reality.
Like territory and resources.
And precisely. He put particular emphasis on the role of territory and resources in shaping the condition of states. He even thought geopolitics could discover actual laws governing international politics.
Laws based on geography.
Yeah, based on the facts of global physical geography. Continents, oceans, whether a country was mainly a sea power or a land power, that sort of thing. And the term geopolitics itself, it sounded new, scientific almost. It suggested looking into these geographical aspects of states that maybe hadn't been paid much attention before.
And Cagellan wasn't just an academic locked away somewhere.
No, not at all. He later became a conservative member of the Swedish parliament. He had strong views on nationalism, on foreign policy. So, this mix of theory and practical politics was there from the start.
Okay, so why did this new science, if we can call it that, catch on so fast? It sounds like it tapped into something, some anxiety maybe?
It definitely did. There were a few big factors. The first one was this real upswing in economic nationalism and trade protectionism.
Ah,
You had the big European empires, Britain, France, getting worried about the global economy, about the U.S. becoming this huge trading power. So they started thinking more about protecting their own economic turf, their resources, made territory seem really important.
a kind of economic anxiety even back then in a world that was globalizing.
Yeah, very much so. Then the second factor was just aggressive imperial expansion.
To scramble for Africa and all that.
Exactly that, and elsewhere too. Mid to late 19th century, empires were bumping up against each other all over the globe.
Right.
Britain and France and North Africa, Britain and Russia and Central Asia, the famous Great Game.
Mm-hmm.
Halford Mackinder, a key British geopolitical thinker, called it the post-Columbian era. Basically, the exploring was done. Now it was about dividing up the map.
High states.
Very high stakes.
Mm.
And all this competition led to massive rearmament, especially between Britain and Germany. People started getting really nervous about a big war breaking out right there in Europe.
Real powder keg situation.
Mm.
And the third factor.
The third one, maybe less obvious but crucial, was the growth of universities and geography becoming a proper academic discipline.
Ah, okay. So academia gets involved.
Yeah, suddenly there were new departments, new jobs for scholars to research and teach this stuff. And the idea that geopolitics was scientific, That was gold for them.
Gave them legitimacy.
Exactly. Gave geography departments intellectual clout and made them seem relevant to pressing political issues. So you had academic ambition meeting political anxiety. Perfect timing, in a way.
That's a fascinating mix, an academic field kind of feeding off national fears. And speaking of fears, you mentioned something surprising. This was also the time when invasion novels became a thing.
Oh yeah, hugely popular. They give you this amazing window into what ordinary people were worried about between the 1870s and 1914.
Like what? Give us an example.
Well, the classic is George Chesney's The Battle of Dorking from 1871. It's a fictional story about Germany invading England. Imagine reading that at the time.
Wow, yeah. That would definitely tap into anxieties.
And another big one was Erskine Childer's Riddle of the Sands in 1903. A couple of British guys uncover a German plot to invade. By 1914, there were apparently over 400 books like this published.
400?
Yeah, all reflecting these Anglo-German tensions, the arms race, the competition for empire, fears about spies, invasion. It was all bubbling up in popular culture.
And this wasn't just a British thing, you said?
No, not at all. These invasion stories were big in Japan, too, especially around their war with Russia in 1904. And in the U.S., you had writers like H. Irving Hancock imagining a German invasion of the East Coast.
So these geopolitical worries were really spreading through popular culture everywhere.
They really were.
Now, the U.S. was becoming a major player then. What about American contributions? I know Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan is a key name.
Absolutely Mahan. His book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660-1783, published back in 1898, was incredibly influential.
He advised the government, didn't he? Teddy Roosevelt.
He did. He was president of the Naval War College before that, so he had real strategic credibility. He looked back at history, especially Britain versus France, and argued that naval power was the key factor for a nation's global power.
The handmaiden of expansion, I think was his phrase.
That's the one. Sea power lets you project influence globally. He believed the U.S., being expansionist, needed a powerful navy to dominate the Atlantic and Pacific, keep rivals like Germany and Russia in check.
And his ideas reached Germany.
Oh, yes. His work was translated, widely read in Germany, and significantly influenced their geopolitical thinking later on in the 20s and 30s. Especially their ideas about pan-regions, these large spheres of influence.
That's a really important link. American naval strategy feeding into German geopolitical theory. So what was happening inside Germany itself, academically?
Well, Kehlen's ideas got picked up quickly in Germany. Scholars there started digging into this link between politics and geography. One of the most important figures was Frederick Ratzel.
Professor at Leipzig.
That's him, professor of geography. He came from a natural science background, influenced by Darwin. And he had this famous idea, the state as a superorganism.
Like a living being.
Exactly. He saw the state existing in this competitive world, shaped by its environment, needing to struggle to survive, and like any organism, it needed to acquire territory and resources to thrive.
So growth was essential, expansion.
It was fundamental for Ratzel. A strong state would naturally seek to expand to gain what he called Lebensraum, living space.
Ah, Lebensraum. That term has heavy connotations later on.
It certainly does. But for Ratzel, it was part of this ceaseless cycle of growth and decline. States compete for space, some win, some lose. He saw this search for living space as a basic, unchangeable geopolitical law.
Almost like a natural law.
That's how he presented it. And unsurprisingly, he was a big advocate for a German empire, a strong navy to protect its interests overseas. Someone called Germany a land of geographers because they had these early established geography departments.
And what happened to these ideas after Germany lost World War I?
Well, the defeat in 1918 and then the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which took away territory and imposed heavy reparations, that really crushed German ambitions for a while.
Understandably.
And it created deep resentment. So when Ratzel's ideas about the state needing Lebensraum started getting revived in the interwar years, people outside Germany got nervous. French geographers like Paul Vidal de la Blache were particularly worried.
Worried they'd be used to justify revenge?
Exactly. They saw how these theories about the superorganism state could easily be twisted to justify a resurgent Germany trying to claw back lost territory. The academic ideas had real dangerous potential.
It sounds like these weren't just German ideas floating around, though. Other European countries were engaging with this, too.
Oh, definitely. Geographers, military officers across Europe were picking up on these themes, often tying them to their own colonial projects or national identities.
Like in Portugal?
Yeah, in Portugal, under Salazar in the 30s, you had campaigns, new maps in schools, all emphasizing Portugal's colonial history, its mission, in the Portuguese-speaking world, using geography to build national identity.
Makes sense.
In Italy, Mussolini's regime started a journal called Geopolitica to discuss Italian ambitions in the Mediterranean, in Africa, aligning with their imperial goals.
In Spain.
Spain was focused more on its colonial ambitions in North Africa, projecting military power there. The interesting thing, though, is that for Portugal and Spain, the focus was mostly on their overseas colonies.
Unlike Germany.
Right. Germany, especially with Ratzel and later thinkers, was much more focused on continental Europe, on expansion closer to home, different geographical priorities.
Okay, that brings us to a much darker phase. Part 2. Geopolitics becoming the intellectual poison, especially during the interwar period in World War II.
Yeah, this is where the reputation really plummets.
How did it go from this, emerging academic field to being branded an intellectual poison? That's a dramatic shift.
It's incredibly dramatic. The quote comes from Richard Hartshorne, an American geographer who'd worked for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, during the war. In 1954, he just tore into geopolitics.
What did he say exactly?
He called it intellectually fraudulent, ideologically suspect, and tainted by association with Nazism, and its associated policies of genocide, racism, spatial expansionism, and the domination of place.
Wow, that's about as strong a condemnation as you can get.
Absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
And he wasn't alone. Other influential geographers like Isaiah Bowman felt the same way.
So this wasn't just one guy's opinion.
Not at all. It led to this widespread rejection of geopolitics, especially by geographers in the U.S. and also the Soviet Union. It wasn't just academics. Within 50 years of Gagellon coining the term, major American magazines, Reader's Digest, Life, Newsweek, were publishing articles condemning it. The taint was public and profound.
And at the center of this firestorm is one name that keeps coming up. Karl Haushofer. Who was he? Why was he seen as the guru?
Karl Haushofer, born 1869, he was a German army officer, rose to major general, retired after World War I. But before that, a key experience. He was sent to Japan from 1908 to 1910.
To study their military.
Exactly. And while there, he learned Japanese, got really interested in the culture, and his interactions with Japanese officers and geographers were apparently critical for encouraging geopolitical studies in Japan later on.
So his influence was international pretty early on.
Very much so. After retiring, he became a professor of geography at the University of Munich, and in the mid-1920s, he launched the Journal of Geopolitics. He became this huge intellectual figure, not just in Germany and Japan, but surprisingly, also in South America.
South America? How?
His work got translated into Spanish and Portuguese. Military thinkers in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, they read him, used his ideas.
Even decades later.
Yeah, get this. Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, actually wrote a book called Geopolitica way later in 1968.
Oh.
Yes. And listen to this quote from Pinochet's book. Geopolitics tries to give a scientific and reasoned explanation of the life of these super beings states who are born, develop, and die, showing all kinds of appetites and a powerful instinct for conservation.
That's pure Ratzel and Haushofer, the state as an organism, still echoing decades later in a completely different context.
Exactly. It shows how potent that core idea remained, especially in certain military circles.
Okay, so back to Haushofer himself. What were his main ideas, and how did they connect, or seem to connect, to what the Nazis were doing? He believed in geographical realities shaping survival, like Ratzel.
He absolutely did. Very much in Ratzel's vein, Haushofer stressed the need for relentless acquisition of territory and resources. Yeah. And crucially, that concept of Lebensraum, living space, especially looking eastwards.
Towards Eastern Europe.
Primarily, yes. Yeah. He thought for Germany to be a true world power, its leaders had to understand 5 key elements: location, resources, territory, shape, morphology, and population. Germany needed to be, in his words, space-hopping, not space-bound, meaning it had to expand.
And these pan-regions you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that was another big idea he pushed. Germany, Japan, other powerful states should carve out their own huge economic and geographic zones, their own hinterlands, free from outside meddling.
So a world divided into spheres of influence.
Pretty much. For Germany to dominate its slice of Eurasia, he actually thought an alliance with the Soviet Union was key, and understanding with Britain, which he saw controlling Africa.
Interesting. And he was keen on that Berlin-Baghdad railway project, too.
Very keen. Saw it as a way to project German power into the Middle East, Central Asia. The British hated the idea, obviously, saw it as a threat. The project died after World War I, But the underlying idea of eastward expansion, of needing resources, appealed to German nationalists and industrialists alike.
But the really toxic connection, the one that damned him in many eyes, was his personal link to the Nazis, right? Specifically Rudolf Hess.
That was critical, yes. Especially for American critics looking back at the 1940s. Haushofer was close friends with Rudolf Hess.
Hitler's deputy.
Exactly. And Hess had actually been Haushofer's student back at the University of Munich. That connection looked incredibly suspicious.
And then there's Mein Kampf.
Right. Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, explicitly uses terms like Lebensraum, living space, when talking about needing to overturn Versailles and find Germany's destiny in the East. The language overlapped. To outsiders, it looked like Haushofer provided the intellectual blueprint.
But we need to be careful here, right? Was Haushofer really the architect of Nazi ideology? Or is it more complicated than that?
It's much more complicated, and that's a crucial distinction to make. Haushofer was obsessed with spatial relationships, the organic state, the mechanics of geography and power.
Okay.
Hitler, on the other hand, his driving force was race, the Aryan race, his horrific hatred of Jewish people. That was paramount. That racial ideology did not come from Haushofer's writings.
So where did they overlap?
Really only on that core idea of the state as a superorganism needing living space. That's where their thinking aligned.
And Haushofer's actual influence within the Nazi regime wasn't always that strong?
No. By the late 1930s, early 40s, his influence was actually waning. He didn't buy into the Nazi conspiracy theories about Jews and communists. He apparently thought invading the Soviet Union in 1941 was a massive strategic blunder. And his connection to Hess, his former student, became a huge problem after Hess flew secretly to Scotland in 1941. Made Haushofer look suspect to the regime.
So even though his direct influence might have been fading inside Germany, the perception in America, especially after the war, was that he was central. How did that play out?
It played out very badly for the reputation of geopolitics. You had these German emigre intellectuals, people like Hans Weigert, Andreas Dorpelin, who'd fled Nazism. They came to the U.S. and basically cemented the idea that German geopolitics was Nazism's scientific partner in crime.
Painting Haushofer as the evil genius.
Pretty much. The evil genius behind the Nazi menace. That was the narrative, and it stuck. After the war, you had Father Edmund Walsh, this American colonel and Jesuit priest, interrogate Haushofer.
The one who wrote the book Total Power.
That's him. Walsh was convinced Haushofer was Hitler's brains trust. He wrote how Nazi invasions followed the broad pattern laid out by Haushofer. But interestingly, even Walsh kind of stopped short of blaming Haushofer's ideas directly for Hitler's racism or expansionism.
A slight nuance there, even from a critic.
A slight one. But the damage was done. Haushofer himself faced a tragic end. His son was executed for being part of the plot against Hitler, and Haushofer committed suicide in 1946.
An incredibly dark end. So what was the practical result of all this condemnation for the term geopolitics in the U.S. after the war?
The result was, as Hartshorne said, condemnation and opprobrium. The term was utterly toxic. A whole new generation of American political geographers just wanted nothing to do with it.
They created political geography instead.
Exactly. They deliberately called it political geography to distinguish it, make it seem objective, less deterministic about environment shaping destiny. Leslie Heppel, a scholar who studied this, argues geopolitics basically vanished from American public life between 1945 and 1970.
Really vanished.
Almost completely. There were rare exceptions, like a professor named Joseph Ruchek, who used it as useful shorthand. But mostly, it was avoided. Latest Christoch tried to revive it in the early 60s and apparently got castigated by his colleagues just for mentioning it. Shows you how deep the aversion ran.
Wow, to be castigated just for using the word. That brings us to part 3. The revival and transformation during the Cold War, from the 50s to the 80s.
Yeah, the comeback story.
It's ironic, isn't it? Even while the word geopolitics was taboo, the underlying thinking about territory, power, global struggle that didn't just disappear during the Cold War.
Not at all. The thinking persisted, just under different names or implicitly. You had geographers like Nicholas Spykman talking about the rimlands, these crucial coastal areas around Eurasia.
Where the U.S. and Soviets might clash.
Exactly. And later, Saul Cohen developed the idea of Shatterbelt regions, caught between big powers, prone to conflict. They were still analyzing the territorial and ideological nature of the U.S.-Soviet conflict, trying to map out the potential flashpoints.
And events seemed to confirm their thinking.
Well, yeah. Look at Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis. They all seem to underline this geographical dimension of the Cold War struggle.
Containment strategy is inherently geographical, isn't it?
Absolutely. You had documents like NSC 68 in 1950 warning President Truman about Soviet plans for world domination, framing it geographically. Then came the domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, others nearby would follow, all very spatial thinking.
So the U.S. built alliances based on this.
Right. NATO, CETO, CENTO, a whole network of security pacts designed to contain Soviet influence geographically.
But it's worth noting, some geographers like Saul Cohen actually warned against seeing the world too simply.
How so?
He worried that American strategists, maybe like George Kennan, the architect of containment, sometimes lumped the entire Third World together, missing the huge diversity within it. They saw the Soviet Union as this monolithic expansionist threat, maybe without appreciating all the local complexities and nationalisms. Interesting. So the geographical thinking was there, but maybe sometimes too simplistic. And then, against all odds, the actual term geopolitics starts to creep back in, often credited to Henry Kissinger.
Yes, Kissinger is widely seen as the key figure in its rehabilitation, at least in the U.S. context.
He was different from previous secretaries of state, wasn't he? More academic.
Very much so. A German émigré, a Harvard intellectual. His PhD was actually on 19th century European diplomacy, basically, historical geopolitics. He came into the Nixon administration during a complex time.
Détente, Vietnam.
Exactly. The U.S. was stuck in Vietnam, the relationship with the Soviets was thawing but still tense, and relations with China were just starting to open up. Kissinger used geopolitics to help make sense of this new, shifting landscape.
But not in the old, rigid scientific law kind of way.
No, much more pragmatically. As Leslie Heppel pointed out, Kissinger used it more informally to talk about the need for global equilibrium, about enduring national interests in a world driven by a balance of power.
Trying to manage the superpowers.
Right. He wanted to engage China to counterbalance the Soviets. He famously said, "Equilibrium was the name of the game. We agreed on the necessity to curb Moscow's geopolitical ambitions." He saw China's challenge to Moscow as ideological, too, but the core was managing the power balance.
So, a more flexible approach.
Yes, he felt American policy had become too rigid, too reliant on just military thinking. In an era where American power felt relatively weaker, especially after Vietnam, he argued for flexibility, for political maneuvering, like opening relations with China. His use of the term, even if sometimes a bit vague, definitely helped bring geopolitics back into the American political conversation.
And then this revival feeds into a tougher stance later on, particularly under Reagan.
It certainly paved the way. Other big figures started using the term too, like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor.
Also an academic, originally.
Right. They used geopolitics to signal America's strategic interests, especially as Cold War tensions ramped up again. And for the emerging neoconservative movement, it became a way to frame the Soviet Union as this relentless expansionist threat.
And this thinking had real-world consequences, like in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. The decision from 1979 onwards to fund the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan was pure geopolitical logic. Contained Soviet expansion at all costs.
Even if it meant backing proxies.
Even if it meant the U.S. and allies like Pakistan supported Islamist fighters against the Soviets. And as we now know, that decision had huge unintended long-term consequences, helping forge groups like al-Qaeda and empowering figures like Osama bin Laden.
A chilling example of blowback from a geopolitical strategy.
Definitely. And this revived geopolitical focus led to things like the Committee on the Present Danger. This was a group of influential figures, many of whom would join the Reagan administration.
What was their argument?
They used geopolitics to argue that détente was naive, that America needed a much more aggressive stance. They believed the Soviets were aiming for domination over the entire Euro-Asian landmass.
And Reagan adopted this worldview.
Largely, yes. The Reagan administration ramped up support for anti-Soviet forces globally, backing Contras against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, supporting groups fighting Soviet-backed regimes in Africa.
Even supporting Saddam Hussein in Iraq back then.
Yes, supporting Iraq against Iran in the early 80s fit the geopolitical logic of countering Soviet influence and perceived Iranian radicalism. Supporting anti-communist military regimes in Latin America also fit the pattern. Plus, deploying new nuclear missiles in Western Europe to counter the Soviets.
So by the mid-'80s, geopolitics wasn't just an academic term anymore. It was code for a specific, assertive foreign policy.
It really was. In the U.S. context, by the mid-'80s, it was heavily associated with political realism, with maintaining American power in what they called the Second Cold War. It became shorthand for thinking about great power rivalries, pursuing national interests in a dangerous anarchical world. The Nazi taint had faded in the U.S., replaced by this Cold War strategic meaning.
Okay, this sets the stage perfectly for part 4. Challenging the mainstream, the rise of critical geopolitics from the late 20th century to today.
Right, where the pushback begins again, but from a very different angle.
This sounds like where things get really interesting, because it questions that whole realist way of seeing the world that had become dominant again.
It really does. This traditional, or realist, view of geopolitics basically assumes the world is anarchical, no world government, right? So states are just out for themselves, projecting power. That's the driving force.
Self-interest and survival.
Pretty much. And a lot of traditional geopolitical writing, even if it doesn't explicitly say, I'm a realist, operates with that basic assumption. It resonated strongly, for example, with military leaders in places like Latin America in the 60s and 70s. It seemed to explain a dangerous world full of communist threats.
And critical geopolitics says, what? That this view is wrong. Too simple.
Both, really. Critics argue this realist-inspired view is one-dimensional. It focuses way too much on conflict and competition, and ignores or downplays cooperation, diplomacy, détente.
Like the UN or the EU.
Exactly. The international system has developed ways to collaborate, build institutions, create international law. It's not just a free-for-all. Plus, this newer generation of critical writers, they're skeptical of the claim that realists just tell it as it is.
We don't think it's objective.
No. They argue that the realist view itself is shaped by particular ways of seeing the world, by language, by culture. It's not some neutral description. It's maybe not surprising it caught on in the U.S., where commentators often present their big ideas about the world as if they're just stating obvious truths. Critical geopolitics questions that very claim to objectivity.
Okay, so if it's all about narratives and perspectives, how do critical scholars suggest we actually unpack these powerful geopolitical stories? How do we analyze them?
They offer a few key approaches, drawing partly on feminist thinkers like Donna Haraway. First, look at how geopolitics is made and represented for specific audiences.
What does that mean?
It means recognizing that global politics isn't natural or inevitable. It's imbued with social and cultural meaning. The stories we tell about international relations are just that, stories. Some are more powerful than others, of course.
Especially stories told by powerful leaders.
Exactly. A speech by a U.S. president or a Russian president carries immense weight in framing how events are understood globally. That's why things like the State of the Union address get so much attention. It's about the power of the narrative being constructed.
So step 1 is deconstruct the story. What's next?
Second, view geopolitics as discourse, meaning it's a system of language that actively produces and circulates spatial representations of global politics.
It creates understanding.
Yes, the focus is on how the language used in policy documents, in speeches, shapes how we understand a situation and how it contributes to identity politics, how a nation sees itself and others. The Cold War is the classic example.
Leader of the free world versus evil empire.
Precisely. Those weren't just descriptions. They were powerful labels that constructed identities, defined threats, and justified actions. They created imagined geographies.
And the third point connects it more to real people's lives.
Yes, and this is crucial. The third insight is that global geopolitics is deeply entangled with gender, race, and class. It's not some abstract force acting equally on everyone.
How so?
Critical scholars point out that the everyday experience of, say, women and children dealing with conflict or economic hardship is often fundamentally different from men's experiences. Concepts like borders, territory, security, they mean different things if you're talking about war rape in the Democratic Republic of the Congo versus young men migrating from North Africa to Europe.
Different vulnerabilities, different impacts.
Exactly. As the feminist scholar Cynthia Enloe argues, geopolitics has to connect to the everyday geographies of gender relations if we really want to understand the human impact of borders, conflict, migration. It forces us to look beyond the big maps and grand strategies.
That's powerful. Now, to help grasp how geopolitics actually functions out there in the world, critical geopolitics offers a framework, doesn't it? Formal, practical, popular.
Right. That's a very useful distinction made by the political geographer Geroid of Tuateo. He talks about 3 interconnected levels. First, formal geopolitics. That's the academic world, scholars, commentators, think tanks, explicitly using the intellectual tradition, debating theories.
Okay,
Then there's practical geopolitics. This is about the policy world, the geographical ideas and templates that political leaders and their advisors actually use to understand and act in the world.
like President Bush's axis of evil.
Perfect example. It's designed to simplify, Label friends and enemies, create a clear picture for action.
And the third level.
Popular geopolitics.
Yeah.
This is about how ordinary citizens make sense of world events through media and culture, news reports, movies, cartoons, novels, the internet.
So the academic sphere, the policy sphere, and the public sphere. But they're not totally separate.
Not at all. Otuatel stresses they're deeply interconnected. Academics influence policy. Policymakers use ideas that resonate publicly. Media picks up on academic and policy language. Ideas and discourses circulate between all three.
And these frameworks help people make sense of things.
Yes, they help individuals and groups understand the world, locate themselves within it. Phrases like axis of evil are catchy precisely because they simplify. They offer a seemingly clear map of a complex world, identifying who's good and who's bad. A leader might toss out a phrase like that, and suddenly it's being debated by everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. And these different ways of seeing the world exist within broader national geopolitical cultures. Can you give examples, maybe Britain and Russia?
Sure, Otuatel talks about how a state's geopolitical culture influences how it sees its place in the world. For Britain, its island geography has been hugely significant, not as destiny, but in how British culture has interpreted its position.
The island nation idea.
Right. And its wartime experiences like standing alone against Germany, the Blitz, that's deeply embedded. So when Argentina invaded the Falklands in 1982, Margaret Thatcher and the media immediately framed it using World War II parallels. It instantly resonated culturally and justified sending the Navy.
And Thatcher emphasized the U.S. relationship then.
She did. She leaned heavily on the special relationship with the U.S. for support, arguably prioritizing that over the European Britain tradition. Otuatel actually identifies 4 competing traditions in British culture: Little England, Cosmopolitan Britain, European Britain, and American Britain. Different ways of seeing Britain's place.
Competing narratives within one country. What about Russia?
For Russia, geographer Graham Smith points to 3 recurring traditions in how its leaders and public understand its position. One sees Russia as fundamentally European, needing to follow Western models.
Okay.
Another sees Russia as this unique Euro-Asian civilization, distinct from both Europe and Asia. And a third views Russia as a bridge between Europe and Asia, similar perhaps to how Britain sometimes sees itself.
So different identities competing for dominance.
Exactly. And depending on the historical moment, one tradition might become dominant, shaping policy and how Russia presents itself, just like George W. Bush's administration promoted a specific vision of a global U.S. role after 9/11. These cultural frameworks matter.
This focus on culture and representation reminds me of another critical voice you mentioned earlier, Yves Lacoste. What was his main contribution?
Yves Lacoste, a French geographer, was definitely a pioneer of this critical approach. His 1976 book had a provocative title, something like "Geography is, above all, concerned with the making of war."
Wow, doesn't pull any punches.
Not at all. He famously showed how U.S. military planners during the Vietnam War used detailed geographical knowledge maps of rivers, jungles, infrastructure, specifically to inflict ecocide, deliberately destroying the environment to hurt the enemy.
Using geography as a weapon.
Precisely. He also analyzed the geopolitical writings of people like Pinochet in Chile. Now remember, Pinochet was actually a professor of geopolitics before he became dictator.
Right, we mentioned his book.
Lacoste pointed out how Pinochet embraced that state as organism idea, and then arguably put it into practice when he overthrew Allende's government in 1973 with U.S. backing. And
Kissinger's infamous quote about Chile fits right in there.
It does. Kissinger basically saying the Chilean people couldn't be trusted to make the right choice. Lacoste's point was that geopolitical writers needed to be much more self-aware, more critical about how their ideas could be used to justify militarism and state power. His journal, Herodote, still continues that critical work today, analyzing things like the War on Terror. He advocated for what he called critical regional analysis, really understanding local context and seeing the link between geographic knowledge and political action.
So bringing it all together, despite this incredibly checkered, controversial past, the term geopolitics is still everywhere today. Why does it persist? Why is it still so popular?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yep.
I think there are a few reasons. First, it deals with inherently compelling stuff. Dangers, threats, space, and power. Big, dramatic themes that grab attention.
The high stakes of world politics.
Exactly. Second, it offers simplicity. It seems to help explain the world in simple terms. Ideas like mapping out global power blocks, even if they oversimplify, can feel reassuringly concrete in a messy world.
A sense of order.
Right. Third, it seems to empower users to make predictions about the future. Think about concepts like the clash of civilizations or the rise of China, or even Fukuyama's end of history, which implied an end to geopolitical struggle. Pundits use geopolitics constantly to forecast the next big thing.
So it offers drama, simplicity, and predictability. A potent mix.
A very potent mix.
Yeah.
And honestly, most people tossing the term around today probably have little interest in understanding that contorted intellectual history we've just discussed.
They just use it as shorthand.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Shorthand to make their analysis sound serious, give it that rugged respectability, show they're dealing with the grim geographical realities of world politics. You see commentators like Thomas Barnett doing this, claiming, much like the old geopoliticians, to have this clear vision of how the world works and where it's heading.
So given that landscape, the term being widely used, often stripped of its history, what's the goal or the future for critical geopolitics?
The goal for critical writers is really to keep scrutinizing those claims, to challenge the easy answers and grand predictions, and importantly, to suggest other geographical ways of representing and understanding the world.
Like focusing on human security.
Exactly, like emphasizing human security, thinking about the gendered nature of global geopolitics, who actually bears the brunt of conflict or economic policy. It's often about trying to liberate populations from oppressive geopolitical structures, pushing for geographical perspectives that might lead to a more equal world, challenging those dominant narratives about states and power. It's about asking different questions, centering different experiences.
A vital counter-narrative. Okay, let's wrap this up.
That's good.
What a fascinating and sometimes deeply disturbing journey we've been on today. We started way back in 1899 with Gellin coining geopolitics. We saw it rise, get condemned as intellectual poison because of the Nazi connection, practically disappear in the U.S. after the war, only to be revived during the Cold War. And now we've ended up with these critical perspectives that force us to question the very foundations of how we talk about geography and power.
It's quite the roller coaster. And it's crucial to remember, as we touched on, that this history isn't just the Anglo-American story. Geopolitics had different trajectories elsewhere.
Like in South America or Russia.
Exactly. In places like Argentina or Chile, military academies kept teaching geopolitics right through the post-war period when it was taboo in the U.S. They didn't necessarily carry that same heavy stigma of Nazism. And even today, you hear talk of the new great game in Central Asia with the U.S., China, Russia competing for influence. The core ideas, the focus on territory and power, are still very much alive.
So why does wading through all this history matter for you listening right now? Well, understanding the story gives you tools. When you hear someone use the word geopolitics in the news or read it in an article, you now know the sheer weight behind that word. You know the different ways it's been used, the controversies, the hidden assumptions it might carry. It helps you spot the stories being told about the world and maybe question them.
Exactly. This deep dive shows that these geographical templates, these ways of mapping the world, they aren't just neutral facts. They're often constructions, powerful ways of simplifying reality, often to serve particular interests.
Right.
Knowing that lets you ask, whose interests? Whose perspective is missing? What are the human consequences of looking at the world this way? It encourages that critical thinking.
And that leaves us with maybe one final provocative thought for you to mull over. If geopolitics has shifted from trying to be a science of state power to becoming a lens for analyzing how power itself is constructed and felt, what's next? What new critical viewpoints might emerge, especially when we face global challenges like climate change or pandemics, things that don't respect traditional borders at all? How will our ideas of space and territory keep evolving in a world that seems both more connected and perhaps more fractured than ever?
That is a great question, and definitely something for future deep dives to explore.